Welcome everyone to the third episode of Biz Group's Industry Insight series. Today we're going to be talking to JD Dillon, Chief Learning Architect at Axonify, about the power of technology dynamically shaping the future of learning. Welcome JD, and thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
In terms of, so if you think about the age-old logic of the whole 70-20-10 models, the ideas of peer-to-peer learning, on-the-job learning, social learning, and that shift, that mass shift to work from home. And so the sudden change of the goalposts of going, okay, I would historically learn my job if I'm a frontline guy, standing next to somebody else, doing the same task. And that's what we defined as peer-to-peer learning or on-the-job learning. But if you, I mean, the nature of this conversation, internet drops out, you suddenly go all static and you're going, is this person seeing what I'm seeing? Did they hear the last 3 minutes of what I just said? What do you think, if any, the long-term ramifications of a mass work from home shift will be on something like 70-20-10 or something like social learning and how we do that?
I think that challenge is much bigger than learning and development or social learning as a construct. I think it's really a question about the nature of community as related to the workplace. I mean, how many people rely on the connections they have at work for a considerable amount of their social experience, right? And it's hard to maintain that level of connection when you don't physically see people, regardless of, because there's people on both sides, right? There's a ton of people love to champion and say, work should have always been like this. And there's people saying, you can't possibly have the same kind of collaboration if we're not in the room, right? It's all over the place. There's thought leaders on every side. And frankly, I think it's going to require organizations to sit down and take a hard look at what community means within an organization and what type of effort do they put forth in order to close that gap or fill the gaps that might emerge in a more work from home or hybrid work reality? Because the frank truth is that happenstance is gone, right? I ran into, we had a conversation, hey, can you help me? All of that's missing. And it's been replaced largely, at least I've done some light research into the impact of working from home in terms of habits that evolve out of that. Light, not academic in nature. And I very quickly started to realize that a lot of that happenstance is replaced by structure automatically. People, instead of tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, hey, can you show me? They put a meeting in a calendar and now take a block of time off of themselves and someone else in order to have that conversation. And then calendars start to explode, and that starts to negatively impact people's ability to focus on their work. And so we have this awkward trade-off happening to try to replace certain elements of that community. And as someone who's worked from home for most of a decade at this point, I recognized even in my own habits last year that I was built to focus on habits for working from home that related to productivity, right? Being able to do the job as effectively as I could have if I was in the office and using technology to crutch some of those elements. I hadn't necessarily looked at the communal side of work and connections and culture, and I think that became even more pressing when suddenly my entire team went remote, as opposed to me historically having been the remote person working with a team that's primarily office-based. So I think for learning and development purposes, it's about how we connect to that conversation of community and work with partners in the organization, recognize technology is not going to fix that problem, and suddenly create a sense of community, no matter how many Slack or Teams channels you have, right? It's going to take an effort from people across an organization to really look at the culture and say, what does community mean to this organization? How do we foster a sense of meaningful connection amongst people, whether it be specifically about work they're doing or just the nature of being part of an organization? And what types of practices do we put in place, acknowledging that it's not going to be the same? You're not going to take the experience of what it was to work 8.5 hours a day, 9 hours a day in an office with a group of people, move that to everyone now being at home and make it the same, right? It's how do we make it what it needs to be for this experience, involve people in that conversation, and then learning and support has to come along with that narrative to say, well, how do we support people in developing the right habits and having access to the right resources, being able to connect with one another in meaningful ways, not just to get the tasks done, but to build that sense of camaraderie, community, and kind of social nature that then builds trust and connections that allows people to lean on one another, to ask that question, to say, hey, can you show me? Because a lot of that, especially if you're new to an organization or you haven't really established that type of connection with other people, it's going to take more effort to get there, where in the past, maybe a couple conversations over lunch gets you there. So it's going to require a meaningful effort from people within organizations, as opposed to saying, well, technology is going to fix this. Let's just launch Teams. Now we're connected in a community. That's not how this works.
So I know you were chatting to the guys at Southwest recently, and taking them as an example, or somebody else you've chatted to in the last 6 months, who have you spoken to that is just really getting certain elements of building that community right? And what were they doing that people might be able to take 1% of and go, you know what, that could work for us too. That's helped drive the business forward one step.
My favorite example is still from New Zealand with Briscoe Group. I wrote an article about their beginnings of their story in the middle of last year that was in Training and Development magazine in Australia. And what really stood out in the conversation I had with Aston Moss, who's their director of HR there, was how distinctly they focused on the human experience of work when things started to change. And they support a frontline team as well as a corporate team. And how they really started to have deep conversations as lockdowns began and people moved away from work and started working from home or were waiting for retail stores to reopen, was, how do we maintain the sense of connection with the organization? How do we lean and really over rotate into communication practices and make sure that our communication isn't always about work? It's always about the culture and the people. And sometimes it's keeping people updated on what's changing at work. Sometimes it's just messages of hope and inspiration. Sometimes it's, hey, an interesting message from one of our brand ambassadors or a member of the executive team. But really, they already had, and the key was, and what I found as a key to a lot of organizations that I've talked to that, let's just say, handle this better, right? No one was ready, but we're also never necessarily ready for disruption. It's usually, again, just not like this. But the organizations that seemed better prepared were the ones that were already moving down a path. They had already started to reimagine their approach to how they supported people. They had already started to kind of adopt an ecosystem mentality and this focus on preparing people for what comes next. And the last 12 months challenged that ecosystem, that infrastructure, and that mindset. And I think proved out that this type of an approach where you're focused on putting the right mechanisms and tools in place and not necessarily just focused on training programs and content, while those are important elements, that it's more about making sure that you've got I always talk about L&D needs to look a little bit more like plumbers, where you've got the pieces in place underneath the organization, building that infrastructure out so that no matter what it is, whether it's a major health and safety concern, a major new product release, a process change, a compliance thing, you've got the pieces in place to deal with whatever that is, and you just point your resources in the right direction based on what the priority is today. So back to the original question, I think it's organizations that have really taken a human approach to this from the beginning and really recognize that it's going to be people, and that sense of culture and connection is going to help us get through this, because people have to maintain that sense of purpose and that connection, and recognizing, one, do I have a job tomorrow is critically important, but what role am I playing as this gets harder, right? Because we talked about wellness earlier and resilience and burnout and all of these things that are ongoing. A key part in overcoming all of that is making sure that I understand the part that I play. So organizations that had built that sense of community, focused on the human experience, and made sure that was clear why you're important and what role you're going to play in helping us move forward. And it's not just you're part of the mechanism that's pushing things down a line. You're an important part of the story, and here's the role you're playing, not just for our business, but for potentially our community and our society, given that a lot of people, especially workers on the front line, have helped move regions forward through this, not just their particular business.